The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation went on national television and said something that should have stopped the country cold. He said his agency was kept out of the Nancy Guthrie investigation for 4 days. Not 4 hours, 4 days. He said he had hundreds of agents ready. He said he had a fixed-wing aircraft sitting on a runway in Arizona ready to fly DNA evidence to the best forensic laboratory in the world. He said he had the resources, the technology, and the personnel to process critical evidence within days rather than weeks. And he said they were told no, not by a court order, not by a legal ruling, not by any process that required judicial oversight or democratic accountability. By one man, the sheriff of Pima County, Arizona, a man who, as it turns out, had been lying about his own past for 40 years. A man who beat a handcuffed person nearly to death with a flashlight. A man who was forced to resign from his previous law enforcement job under threat of termination. A man who sat under oath in December of 2025 and told a lawyer he had never been suspended as a police officer. 8 suspensions, 37 days without pay, a man in an ICU, a forced resignation, and he said no. That is the story of how the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was corrupted not from the outside but from the top. Not by a lack of evidence, but by the man who was supposed to be following it. Subscribe right now and turn on every notification because this video covers the full verified record of Sheriff Chris Nanos of Pima County, Arizona. What he did in El Paso before he ever came to Arizona. What he did in the first 4 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. What he said under oath. What the documents say he lied about. What his own deputies said about him. What the FBI director said about him on national television, and what the Board of Supervisors is now doing about it. Every fact in this video is verified and sourced. Stay with us all the way to the end because the full picture only lands when you see all of it together. Before we say another word about Chris Nanos, we need to talk about Nancy Guthrie, because she is the reason every single word in this video matters, and she deserves to be placed at the center of this story before anyone else. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the longtime anchor of NBC's Today Show. She is also the mother of Annie Guthrie, who lives in Tucson. Nancy is not a public figure. She never wanted to be. She was a woman who raised her children largely on her own. She loved her garden. She attended church every Sunday morning without fail for 30 years. She sat on her porch in the evenings in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, one of the most beautiful and peaceful residential communities in Arizona. She had a pacemaker to regulate her heart. She took medication every night at 10 o'clock. She wore hearing aids that came out before bed. She was 84 years old, and she was alone. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner with her daughter Annie and came home. Her garage door closed behind her at 9:50 in the evening. At 1:47 in the morning, her doorbell camera went dark. At 2:28 in the morning, and her pacemaker lost its connection to the home monitoring unit in her bedroom. 41 minutes. That is the window. Everything that happened to Nancy Guthrie happened inside those 41 minutes. And what greeted the investigation from the very first hour set the stage for everything that followed. According to a source close to the investigation who spoke to a News Nation journalist, the supervisor who initially led the response to Nancy's home had never investigated a homicide before being placed in charge of the homicide unit. Not once. Not in any prior case. Not in any prior capacity. The source told that journalist exactly why that happened. They said decisions were made by people who install friends and people who can do things for them, as opposed to people who are there on merit and can do the job correctly. Now, Chris Nanos put a loyal friend in charge of homicide, not the most qualified person available, not someone whose experience matched the gravity of what they were walking into. A friend. And that friend showed up to what would become one of the most watched missing person cases in American history, without the experience to recognize what they were looking at. The source continued, They said there was an immediate rush to judgment that Nancy had simply wandered off, that the investigation was treated as a search and rescue operation rather than a potential criminal case from the beginning, that detectives returned to Nancy's home not once, but multiple times, which tells you clearly that critical evidence was not properly collected on the first visit, not on the second. Multiple returns to a crime scene because the work that should have been done the first time was not done. Every hour that passed with the wrong focus was an hour that whoever took Nancy used to get further away. Now we come to the FBI, because this is where what happened crosses from institutional failure into something that the FBI Director of the United States chose to address on national television. On a nationally syndicated podcast in May of 2026, FBI Director Kash Patel spoke about the Nancy Guthrie case on the record. He said the first 48 hours of anyone's disappearance are the most critical. He said for 4 days his agency was kept out of the investigation. He said he launched hundreds of agents and intelligence staff to Phoenix and Tucson specifically for this case. And he said he had a fixed-wing aircraft sitting on the ground, ready to fly DNA evidence to the FBI laboratory at Quantico in Virginia, which he described as the best lab in the world. And he said they were told no. The DNA was sent instead to a private laboratory in Florida, a lab the Pima County Sheriff's Office had used for 30 or 40 years. Patel said in his exact words that they would have analyzed it within days and maybe gotten better information or more information, that their lab is just better than any other private lab, and that they did not get a chance to do that. They did not get a chance. 4 days, an FBI plane on the ground, hundreds of federal agents on standby, the best forensic laboratory in the country waiting, and the sheriff of Pima County said no. Now, to be completely fair, Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the Pima County Sheriff's Deputies Union, told the same journalist that by the time the FBI was fully brought in, the DNA had already been shipped to Florida. He said the truth is probably somewhere between what Patel said and what Nanos said. And forensic genealogist C.C. Moore has acknowledged that some private labs do have capabilities comparable to Quantico. But here is the question that has never been properly answered. If the private lab in Florida was genuinely comparable to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, why refuse a plane that was already on the ground? Why turn down hundreds of federal agents who were ready, willing, and on standby at that exact moment? Sergeant Cross answered that question directly. He told the journalist there is a grudge. We're a 10-year-old grudge that has been sitting inside Chris Nanos since 2016. That year, the FBI conducted a RICO investigation into the Pima County Sheriff's Office, an investigation into the misuse of funds. One department chief was indicted. A second chief died by suicide. Chris Nanos, who was interim sheriff at the time, was implicated. He was not ultimately charged, but the investigation damaged him. It humiliated him. And according to Sergeant Cross, Chris Nanos never forgave the FBI for it. Cross said there is video from that time documented by a local Tucson news station in which Nanos speaks about the FBI with open contempt visible on his face. Cross said Nanos referred to his own detectives as the real police in a tone that made clear his feelings about federal law enforcement. So Cross told the journalist plainly that, in his opinion and in the opinion of nearly every person he spoke to inside the department, Nanos' resentment toward the FBI shaped every decision he made in the first days and weeks after Nancy Guthrie vanished. Let that land for a moment. An 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker is missing from her home in the middle of the night. The FBI director offers everything: agents, a plane, the best laboratory in the country. And the man running the ground investigation says no because of something that happened to him personally 10 years ago. Sergeant Cross went further. He told the journalist that once the surveillance image of the perpetrator was publicly released, that was the moment, in his professional opinion, when the case should have been fully handed to the FBI. And he said the Pima County Sheriff's Office has 96 detectives total, not hundreds, 96. and the FBI had hundreds of agents already deployed and ready. Cross said bluntly that the FBI's ability to track and manage an investigation of this scale far exceeded anything the sheriff's department could provide. And when the journalist asked Cross directly whether Nanos would ever voluntarily hand this case to the FBI, Cross gave an answer that belongs in the record permanently. He said no, never. He said the size of this man's ego is difficult to describe. Now let us talk about what was happening inside the department during that first week, because what Sergeant Cross described to that journalist should disturb every person following this case. Cross said the investigation in the first week after Nancy disappeared was, and this is his exact word, a mess, an organizational disaster. He said detectives were being sent out to interview witnesses only to discover those witnesses had already been spoken to 4 or 5 times by other teams. Nobody was tracking who had been where. Nobody was maintaining proper records. Units within the same department were not sharing information with each other. Think about what that means operationally. Separate teams within the same sheriff's department were not communicating with each other. And if they were not communicating internally, what chance did the FBI agents on the ground have of integrating effectively? Cross told the journalist that FBI agents working the case almost certainly felt they were being deliberately shut out. He said their perception was probably that they were being blocked. But the reality in his view was even more disturbing than deliberate obstruction. The chaos was not organized. It was incompetence at the leadership level, pure inexcusable failure from the top down. A source inside the department speaking to the same journalist under protected anonymity to avoid retaliation said 3 words that have stayed with everyone who heard them. He ruined a great department. This same source said the morale inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office is at the lowest point it has ever been, that deputies are walking on eggshells, that the people wearing that badge every day are embarrassed by what is happening at the top. And then came the vote. Every single deputy in the Pima County Sheriff's Deputies Union voted that they have no confidence in Sheriff Chris Nanos, 100%. Or not one deputy who voted had confidence in their own sheriff. The people who work alongside him every day, who sees how decisions are made, who knows what goes on behind the press conferences and the public statements, every single one of them. Sergeant Cross explained that this was not the first time the union had taken this step. But with the eyes of the entire country fixed on Pima County, the message was impossible to ignore. The nation now knows that the people who work for Chris Nanos do not trust him. But even that is not the most important part of this story. Because everything we have covered so far, the chaos, the ego, the grudge, and the mismanaged investigation, all of it takes on a completely different dimension when you understand who Chris Nanos actually is, who he was before he ever put on a badge in Arizona, what he did in El Paso, Texas, and what he spent 40 years making sure nobody found out. We need to go back to 1976. Chris Nanos joins the El Paso Police Department. He begins building an identity around the idea of being a lawman, a career in law enforcement, service and protection, the professional image he would carry into Arizona and eventually into the sheriff's office of Pima County. But here is what the public records show about those years in El Paso. Between 1979 and 1982, Chris Nanos was suspended 8 separate times by the El Paso Police Department, 8 times in 3 years. These were not paperwork errors. These were not administrative technicalities. Let us walk through what those suspensions were actually for. First suspension, violating department orders. Second suspension, making threats while off duty. Our third suspension, illegal gambling while off duty. Fourth suspension. This is the one that should stop you completely. Pima County Supervisor Dr. Matt Hines, speaking publicly on a national news program in April of 2026, stated that Nanos beat a handcuffed man almost to death with a flashlight. That man was taken to the intensive care unit. A handcuffed man, already in custody, already restrained, unable to defend himself. And Chris Nanos beat him with a flashlight until he required intensive care, fifth suspension, habitual tardiness. He could not show up on time. Sixth suspension, insubordination. Seventh and eighth suspensions, additional violations. In total, 37 days without pay across those 3 years. And in 1982, the El Paso Police Department gave him a choice: resign or be terminated. He resigned. Fox News reported in March of 2026, citing Arizona public records obtained through a records request, that Nanos resigned in lieu of termination from the El Paso Police Department and did not properly disclose this on his subsequent employment applications in Arizona. He hid it. He buried the suspensions. He buried the resignation under threat of termination. He crossed state lines and built an entire law enforcement career in Arizona on a foundation of deliberate silence about what he had done in Texas. For 4 decades, nobody in Arizona knew. And then on December 11th, 2025, in a deposition in a lawsuit filed by Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of his own deputies union, a lawyer asked Chris Nanos a direct question under oath. "Have you ever been suspended as a law enforcement officer?" Chris Nanos said no, 8 suspensions. 37 days without pay, a man beaten nearly to death in an ICU, a forced resignation in lieu of termination. And he looked that lawyer in the eye under oath and said no. AZ Central reported in March of 2026, citing official El Paso Police Department records and the deposition transcript, that Nanos denied under oath that he had ever been suspended, while public records directly contradict that claim. CBS News reported in May of 2026 that local officials are alleging Nanos lied under oath during that deposition. Multiple outlets, including The Hollywood Reporter, confirmed that Nanos is accused of hiding his disciplinary past in sworn legal proceedings. This is not rumor. This is not political spin. This is what the documents say. Now, I want you to connect 2 things side by side. The man who lied under oath about being suspended is the same man who told the American public for 3 months that he was doing everything possible to find Nancy Guthrie. The man who beat a handcuffed person nearly to death is the same man whose detectives were responsible for preserving evidence at the scene where Nancy was taken. The man who was forced out of El Paso under threat of termination is the same man who stood in front of cameras and called himself the lead investigator on the most watched missing person case in America. The lies did not start in December of 2025. They go back 40 years, and the pattern they form is not accidental. It is the pattern of a man who has spent his entire career deciding that his own interests matter more than accountability. No, the Pima County Board of Supervisors has now said so in the clearest possible terms. Supervisor Dr. Matt Hines went public with language that no elected official in this case had used before. He told reporters in May of 2026 that this is accountability for a man who has evaded accountability for decades and is himself a public safety threat. A public safety threat. An elected county official used those words about the sheriff of his own county, and Steve Christie, the only Republican on the 5-person board of supervisors, told Fox News he planned to move to vacate Nanos from office entirely, not request his resignation, vacate the office, remove him. Both sides of the political divide, Democrat and Republican, both saying the same thing: he has to go. The board had given Nanos a list of 10 specific demands. They required him to appear personally before them under oath to answer questions about his conduct and his history. They gave him a deadline. They expected him to show up and answer. He sent a lawyer with a letter, not himself, a lawyer. And when that letter was reviewed, Supervisor Christie told Fox News it contained things that were materially not true and provably not true. Sergeant Cross told the journalist what happened after that letter arrived. The deputies' union sent an official letter to the Board of Supervisors requesting that the matter of Nanos' sworn statements be referred to the Arizona Attorney General for a felony perjury investigation. A felony. The people who work for Chris Nanos every single day asked for their own boss to be investigated for a felony. Cross explained that in the state of Arizona, when someone swears to something that is provably false, that is perjury. That is a felony. And when Nanos filed documentation swearing to the contents of that lawyer's letter, which itself contained things that were provably untrue, he created serious legal exposure for himself. Cross told the journalist something that should be heard precisely and completely. He said the whole situation is bizarre because when they found out about the El Paso background, Nanos should never have been a cop in Arizona ever in the first place. He said that if Nanos were in any other position inside the department, he would have been fired for lying about his background and for the content of that background. He should never have been a cop in Arizona ever in the first place. Those are the words of the man who leads the union representing every deputy in that department. Two members of the Board of Supervisors then invoked an 1873 Arizona territorial law and filed a motion to vacate his office entirely. The NY Post reported in May of 2026 that Nanos could lose his job in a matter of days. And there are two more details about this man's conduct that belong in the record even beyond the investigation. On November 6, 2024, Sheriff Chris Nanos went through security at Tucson International Airport. TSA agents found a loaded firearm in his carry-on bag, a loaded gun in a carry-on bag, at airport security. This is the man running the law enforcement agency responsible for finding Nancy Guthrie. And then there is the basketball game on February 8, 2026, while Nancy Guthrie was missing. While her family was living through something most people cannot imagine, while the investigation that his own deputies described as a mess was actively unfolding. Sheriff Chris Nanos attended an Arizona Wildcats basketball game. A former homicide investigator and legal analyst said publicly that for him to be at a basketball game during the most significant case of his career was a disgrace. That word is the right one. Now let us talk about where this case actually stands today. Because despite everything, the investigation is still active. Sergeant Cross told the journalist that 4 or 5 detectives and a sergeant have been physically moved to work out of the FBI building in Tucson. He called this a positive development because it gets investigators out from under the constant interference of command staff and allows them to follow the evidence where it actually leads. But Cross was honest about where the case stands. He said there has been no real buzz inside the department about a major new breakthrough. He said investigators are working through thousands of tips. He said the case is not cold, but there is no working suspect theory that he is aware of. And a source inside the department speaking anonymously said something that captures the full weight of this situation in a single sentence. No direct suspect right now. Not with how the investigation has gone so far. Not with how the investigation has gone so far. That source was not saying the case is impossible to solve. Not they were saying the early failures made it exponentially harder than it should have been. And they were saying it in a way that made clear exactly who was responsible for those failures. Connect every piece of this record one final time. The man who put a friend with no homicide experience in charge of the homicide unit. The man whose department ran the first week like, in the exact words of his own sergeant, a mess. The man whose investigators went back to Nancy's home multiple times because they failed to collect evidence properly the first visit. The man who sent the DNA to Florida instead of loading it onto a federal aircraft. The man who kept the director of the FBI out of this investigation for 4 critical days when the FBI director himself says the first 48 hours are the most important. Or the man who, when his own board demanded answers under oath, sent a lawyer with a letter containing things that were provably not true. The man who has been suspended 8 times. The man who beat a handcuffed person to the point of intensive care. The man who resigned in lieu of termination and then lied about it for 40 years. The man who sat under oath in December 2025 and told a lawyer he had never once been suspended. That is the man who has been leading the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie since February 1st, 2026, Kash Patel said it on national television. 4 days, a plane on the ground, hundreds of agents, the best lab in the world. And he was told no. Sergeant Aaron Cross said it plainly. The size of this man's ego is difficult to describe. Doctor. Matt Hines of the Pima County Board of Supervisors said it publicly. A public safety threat. His own deputies gave him a unanimous no confidence vote. His own sergeant called the first week a mess. And the FBI director went on national television and told the American public that for 4 days his agency was kept out. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She's been missing since February 1st, 2026. She has a pacemaker. She depends on daily medication. She is someone's mother. She is Savannah Guthrie's mother. And Savannah has had to leave her anchor desk multiple times during this investigation because of the weight of what her family is living through. Nancy Guthrie deserves better than what she got. She deserved a competent first responder at her crime scene. She deserved investigators who shared information with each other. She deserved a sheriff who put her safety above his ego. She deserved the FBI plane that was sitting on that runway ready to fly. She got none of it. The Board of Supervisors has started the accountability process. The deputies' union has asked for a felony investigation. The FBI director has spoken publicly. The documents are in the public record. The pattern of deception going back 40 years is verified and confirmed. What comes next, whether that is removal from office, criminal charges, or something that the legal process has not yet determined, is now in the hands of the institutions that are supposed to hold powerful people accountable. We will be watching every development, and we will be here to tell you exactly what each one means. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this case is still moving, and the accountability process surrounding the man who was supposed to be leading it is moving faster than anything else connected to it right now. Drop a comment below. The 4 days the FBI was kept out, the no confidence vote, the 8 suspensions, the lie under oath, the basketball game. Which single moment in this record do you believe reveals the most about who Chris Nanos actually is? Tell us. We read every single one, because Nancy Guthrie's story is not finished, and the story of the man who failed her is only now beginning to be fully told.